Before the blizzard ever touched him, Elias Ward's mare refused to take one more step. That was what saved him, not a cabin, not a fire, not luck, a tired bay mare on a bald winter ridge, staring north at a sky that had gone flat as hammered lead. Elias had been driving the old freight road over Crowknife Divide for 6 days by then. The road was not really a road anymore, it was a buried scar across the mountains, marked by frozen ruts, snapped wagon tongues, and the dark shapes of things men had abandoned when the weather took more from them than they could drag. He was 41 years old. He had one failing mare named Lark, one spring wagon with a cracked reach beam, 2 sacks of flour gone hard as stone, a roll of tarred canvas, and a tool chest that rattled every time the wheels struck hidden rock. Everything else had been left behind at Dead Lantern. The failed copper camp. The room above the assay office, the stove he had sold for medicine, and Ruth. 5 days earlier, Elias had buried his wife behind a collapsed shed, where the ground was too frozen to dig more than a shallow grave. He covered her with stones, because there was no earth left soft enough to hold her. Then he hitched Lark to the wagon, and started south toward his brother's place in the river valley, 60 miles away. He had not cried on the trail. The cold had made that feel like an indulgence. But when Lark stopped on Crowknife Divide, before Elias touched the reins, before the first flakes reached them, he felt something in the animal's body that pulled him out of grief and back into the world. The mare planted all 4 hooves in the snow crust. Her ears lifted, then they pinned flat. Elias looked north. The storm was still far away, but it had already taken the shape of a thing that meant to own the country. The clouds did not climb, they spread low and wide, like an iron lid sliding over the mountains. Beneath them, snow moved sideways along the ground in a pale white smear. Then the wind stopped. That was the warning that mattered. Not the black sky, not the cold, the absence. The ridge went so still that Elias could hear the leather creak in Lark's harness, and the wet click of her breathing. In mountain country, calm before a winter front was not peace. It was air being drawn out of the world before it came back with teeth. Elias stood on the wagon step and studied the land. The freight road curved down into an open basin with no timber, no cabin, no dugout, no smoke anywhere. The valley ranch lay too far south, the storm would catch him long before he reached shelter. So he did not whip the mare forward, he climbed down. He set one hand against Lark's neck until the trembling under her hide steadied. Then he turned away from the road and looked at the cut bank west of the ridge. He was not looking for warmth. Warmth was already gone. He was not looking for comfort. Comfort belonged to men with roofs. He was looking for one thing only. A place where air could be made to stop. The first notch in the cut bank was wrong. Its mouth faced straight north, wide open to whatever was coming. The second had a low roof, but snow had drifted inside, which meant the wind already knew how to enter. Elias kept moving. The third hollow was barely a hollow at all. A shallow bite in a wall of pale limestone, 12 feet across at the front, narrowing toward the back. A fallen slab made a short side wall on the left. The cut bank itself rose hard on the right. Above it, a ledge of rock leaned out just far enough to hold off falling snow. The floor was dry. No powder had gathered in the corners. The opening turned a little southeast, away from the worst of the front moving down from the north. It was not a cave. It was not safe. But Elias saw 3 sides already made by the mountain, and for the first time since Lark stopped on the ridge, he understood the shape of his chance. If he could build the 4th side before the blizzard reached him, the storm might pass over the hollow instead of through it. Years earlier, when Elias still had both hands strong and no gray in his beard, He had worked winter repairs on a narrow bridge above Miller's Gorge. The crew boss was a lean, half-deaf bridgewright named Jonas Keene, a man who trusted smoke more than words. One night, after two men in a nearby line shack froze though their stove still had coals in it, Keene took Elias under the bridge deck with a lantern. Snow was blowing so hard above them that the whole canyon disappeared. Keene held the lantern beside a gap between two warped boards. The flame barely moved, the smoke did. It streamed through the crack in a thin gray thread and vanished into darkness. Keene tapped the boards with his knuckle. "Cold sits," he said, "wind steals." Then he made Elias repeat the rest. A bad room does not freeze, because winter is strong. It dies because the air keeps traveling. Elias had not thought about that lesson for years, not during the mining boom, not when money came easily enough to buy Ruth a blue wool coat from Helena. Not when the cough started. Not when every dollar became another bottle, another doctor, another week they could not afford. But on Crowknife Divide, with the sky closing down and the mare refusing to move, Jonas Keene's lantern came back to him as sharply as if the old man were standing beside him. A wall did not need to be pretty. It did not even need to be strong in the way men bragged about strength. It needed to deny the wind a path. Elias looked back at his wagon. The cracked reach beam had been splitting since Fort Shaw. One wheel leaned outward on the hub. The rear bed slats were bowed from years of sacks, mule feed, and bad roads. A man at Dead Lantern had called it kindling with wheels. Elias had hated him for saying it. Now he looked at the wreck and saw the fourth wall. The realization landed with a dull ache in his chest. That wagon had carried Ruth into the mountains when they still believed the camp would make them a life. It had carried water barrels, sacks of meal, a borrowed sewing machine, a bed frame, stovepipe, medicine crates, and finally the blankets he wrapped around her when she could no longer sit upright. It was the last piece of that life still moving. Before nightfall, he would have to tear it apart. The storm wall thickened as he worked. Elias unhitched Lark first and tied her to a twisted juniper root growing out of the cut bank. Then he climbed onto the wagon with his hammer, pry bar, and numb fingers. The bolts had frozen into their holes. The leather lashings were stiff as horn. He knocked loose the side stakes one by one, each blow ringing flat in the dead air. Splinters snapped off and vanished into the snow. A pin at the rear refused to shift, so he braced one boot against the wheel and drove the pry bar under the bed frame until the wood gave with a crack like a rifle shot. Lark jerked at the sound. Elias did not look at her. The first gust returned then, low and sudden, sliding over the ridge like an animal testing a fence. It struck the wagon and lifted the loose canvas just enough for Elias to see what the storm would do once it arrived in full. Every loose edge would become a sail, every gap would become a throat. He worked faster. By the time he freed the wagon bed from the running gear, his hands had gone clumsy inside his gloves. The left glove had split across the palm. Blood darkened the wool where his skin had opened against a nail head. He tied a rope through the bed frame, crossed it over his chest, and began dragging. The wagon bed did not want to move. It bit into snow crust, it caught on stone, it twisted sideways whenever the rope pulled unevenly. Elias leaned forward until the line cut into his shoulders and made the bones of his ribs feel as if they were being pried apart. Lark tried to step toward him, then stopped when thunder rolled inside the storm cloud. Not thunder from summer rain, a heavy winter sound, muffled and deep, as if the mountains were splitting somewhere under the snow. The mare backed hard against the root. Elias dropped the rope, went to her, and spoke low until she stopped fighting the harness leather. He could not risk using her to drag the frame. One panic would shatter what little he had left. So he pulled it alone. Foot by foot, breath by breath. He dragged the wagon bed off the road and down toward the limestone hollow. The sky lost color, the mountains seemed to flatten. Snow began to skate across the ground in thin white sheets that did not fall from above so much as rise from everywhere at once. When Elias finally reached the hollow, his legs nearly folded under him. He leaned against the limestone wall and coughed until iron filled the back of his throat. Then he looked at the opening. The wagon bed was too tall at one corner and too short at the other. A perfect wall would have saved him time. A broken wall gave him problems. But problems were all he owned. He dragged the frame across the mouth of the hollow with the bed slats facing outward. The left side jammed against the fallen slab. The right side left a triangular gap near the rock. Above the bed there was still space beneath the overhang wide enough for wind to pour through. Elias pulled the tarred canvas from the wagon and threw it over the top edge. The first real blast hit before he could fasten it. The canvas snapped open with a sound like a cannon cap and nearly ripped from his hands. The wagon bed shuddered. Snow hit him sideways, needling under his collar and into his beard. He lunged onto the frame, drove a bent spike through the canvas grommet, and hammered it into the wagon wood. Then another, then another. The hammer slipped twice because his fingers could no longer close around the handle properly. A strap tore loose. For one hanging second, the whole canvas belly filled with wind and bowed outward. If it tore free, the hollow would become worse than open ground. It would become a funnel. Elias threw his weight across the canvas and pinned it down with his body, while the storm pulled at it from the other side. He could feel the fabric trembling beneath him like something alive. He found the loose strap by touch, looped it around a jagged stone knob, and tied it with a knot so ugly Jonas Keene would have cursed him for it. But it held. Then came the slow work, the work that saved him. Not the big wall. The small cracks. Elias crawled along the bottom edge of the wagon frame on his knees. He stuffed dry rabbit brush into the gaps first, because it bent without snapping, then strips torn from an old saddle skirt. Then handfuls of frozen mud scraped from under the limestone lip, pressed into place until his fingers burned with the deep white pain that came before numbness. He worked by sight until the light failed, then by feel. A line of air touched his cheek from the right side of the wall. He turned toward it immediately. The leak was no wider than a knife handle, hidden where the ground dipped under the wagon bed. It was small enough for a careless man to ignore, small enough to seem harmless. But the air that came through it was sharp and constant. It did not blow like a gust. It cut like a wire. Elias stripped off his torn glove and packed the gap barehanded. Mud first. Snow crust over that. Rabbit brush twisted into the seam, leather forced in last with the flat end of the pry bar. His fingertips split. He kept pressing. When the draft disappeared, the hollow changed. It did not become warm. Nothing in that country was warm. But the space stopped moving. Elias crouched in the dimness, breathing hard, and understood that he was no longer building shelter in the ordinary sense. He was building a room the wind had not been invited into. Lark still stood outside, trembling against the juniper root. Elias left her there until the last possible moment. A horse was not only an animal in a storm, it was heat, breath, moisture, weight. A living stove that could panic and kill them both if brought inside too soon. The ridge above the hollow began to howl. That decided it. Elias untied the mare and led her toward the narrow space left beside the wagon bed. Lark balked at once. Her nostrils flared. Her eyes rolled white in the darkening light. Another gust struck the cut bank and threw snow across them like thrown sand. "Easy, girl," Elias said. The words caught in his throat. Ruth had used that same phrase every morning when she brushed Lark outside the assay office, before sickness made the brush too heavy in her hand. Easy, girl. The memory almost broke him. Lark surged sideways into the wagon frame. The whole wall jumped. One spike squealed in the wood. Elias threw both arms around the mare's head and pulled her face against his chest before she could strike the frame again. For several seconds, the hollow became noise and terror, the canvas cracking, the wagon groaning, the mare fighting the dark, the storm hunting the edge of every seam. Elias held on. He pressed his cheek against Lark's cold mane and kept speaking until the words became sound without meaning. Slowly, the animal stopped fighting. Her breath came hard, then slower, then steady. He guided her inside, angled her body along the back wall, and used the last saddle blanket to close the remaining gap at the entrance. He packed snow around the blanket edge and wedged stones against it until no gray line of daylight remained. Then the blizzard arrived. It did not drift in. It hit. The first impact rolled through the limestone like a wagon collision. Dust sifted from the ledge. The canvas slammed inward, then snapped back out. The wagon bed shook so hard Elias felt it through the soles of his boots. Outside, the ridge vanished into sound. Inside, there was only blackness, hoarse breath, cold stone, and the terrible question of whether the fourth wall would hold. The storm pressed against the wagon as if it had hands. It shoved, it searched. It found every weak place and worried at it. Snow dust appeared in thin lines where the seams had not yet frozen shut. Elias followed each pale thread through the darkness, sealing what he could with scraps and mud and pieces of his own torn glove. One leak opened above the canvas, where a spike had worked loose. He climbed onto the wagon frame in the dark, fingers stiff, boots slipping on wood, and hammered the spike back in by feel. The wind struck while he was braced there, and for one instant his body hung between the shelter and the storm, with nothing but a strip of canvas under his knee. He thought of Ruth then. Not as she was at the end. Before that. Laughing in the wagon bed with flour on her sleeves because a sack had split on the road and covered them both in white. The memory came and went in less than a breath. Elias drove the spike home. Below him, Lark stamped hard enough to make the floor tremble. He dropped beside her, one hand on her neck, and listened. The wall still held. That became the night, not sleep. Not rest. Listening. The blizzard roared over the cut bank and slammed into the wagon bed in waves. Sometimes it struck from the north. Sometimes it curled down from above. Sometimes, the whole hollow shivered under a pressure Elias could feel in his teeth. But the air around his face stayed mostly still. That was the difference between life and death. The temperature fell until frost formed on the inside of the wagon slats. Elias's boots numbed against the stone floor, his wounded fingers throbbed, then stopped throbbing. Which frightened him more than the pain had. But the cold did not move freely, it could settle. It could bite. It could wait. It could not run through him. Elias lowered himself beside Lark, close enough to feel the heat coming off her flank. Her breath gathered in slow clouds, and vanished against the darkness. Each exhale added a little moisture to the sealed air. Each movement of her body reminded him that something alive remained inside the mountain's mouth. Hours passed by sound alone. A strap snapped near the top of the wall, the canvas lifted, and freezing air poured down Elias's neck. He rose without thinking, found the torn edge, and jammed the pry bar through canvas and wood until it pinned the flap against the frame. Then he packed snow from the floor into the seam. The snow should have been enemy material. That night it became mortar. Later, another draft opened low under the left corner. Elias followed it with his hand, and found a place where the wagon bed had shifted under the weight of wind. He stuffed in the last strip of saddle leather, then pressed mud over it until his palm froze briefly to the wall. He peeled it away and left skin behind. The storm kept working. So did he. Sometime deep in the night, the blizzard began helping him. At first Elias did not understand it. The blasts still shook the shelter. Snow still hissed against the outside boards. But the small leaks became fewer, the sound grew lower, muffled, farther away. The wind was packing snow against the wagon bed. Every gust drove powder into the cracks from outside. Every drift added weight. The wall that had seemed too weak when Elias built it, was being buried into place by the very storm trying to reach him. By midnight, the wagon no longer felt like a wall standing against the weather. It felt like part of the hill. The hollow darkened further as snow climbed over the opening. The roaring thinned into a heavy underground murmur. Elias realized that what should have trapped him was sealing him better than his own hands could have done. He had not overpowered the blizzard, he had made it finish the work. That thought stayed with him through the last hours. He sat with one arm over Lark's neck, shivering in waves he could not control, and watched nothing because there was nothing to see. In the sealed dark, the world narrowed to breath, wood, stone, and the absence of moving air. He understood then why stronger men died in winter, not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked muscle, because courage did not seal cracks. Muscle did not stop a draft under a door. A fine wagon in the open was still open, a poor wall in the right place could become enough. Near morning, Elias slept without meaning to. He woke to silence, not full silence. The mountain clicked and settled under the new snow, somewhere far above, faint wind passed over the ridge. But the violence was gone. No hammering, no shrieking. No searching fingers of air moving along the seams. Lark shifted beside him. Elias opened his eyes to blackness, and for a moment believed he had gone blind. Then he saw it, a thin blue-white line at the edge of the canvas, so faint it looked imagined. Daylight. He sat up slowly. His whole body objected. Shoulders, knees, ribs, hands. Every part of him felt hammered flat. He reached for the canteen he had kept inside his coat and found it half liquid, half ice. He drank, chewed a strip of frozen venison, and listened once more. No wind inside. That was the answer. He began digging at the blocked entrance with the broken shovel handle. Snow came inward in hard chunks. Cold air entered with it, but the cold no longer arrived as a blade, it simply entered and sat down. When the opening was wide enough, Elias crawled out under the limestone ledge and stood in the morning. The world had been erased. The freight road was gone. The basin below was a smooth, white bowl. The juniper root, the wheel tracks, the broken running gear of the wagon, all disappeared beneath drifts that curved like river sand. The storm had made the whole country look untouched by men, as if no road had ever crossed it and no one had ever believed copper was worth dying for. Lark squeezed out behind him and stood steaming in the pale light. The mare lowered her head, breathed once into the still air, and the white cloud from her nostrils hung there without being torn away. Elias looked back at the hollow, only the top edge of the wagon bed showed through the packed drift. The tarred canvas had frozen into the snow so completely that it looked like black stone under ice. The broken frame, the torn blanket, the mud, the rabbit brush, the scraps of leather, all of it had vanished into a single, sealed shape. No one passing at a distance would have seen a shelter, they would have seen a snowbank against limestone. Elias put one hand on the exposed wagon board. It was the same board Ruth had sat on when they crossed into the copper country 2 years before. The same board he had cursed when it split under ore sacks. The same board another man had dismissed as kindling. Now it was the board that had stood between his lungs and the storm. He left most of the wagon there. There was no way to take it with him. He salvaged the tool chest, one sack of flour, a coil of rope, and the collar harness. Then he fashioned a crude drag from the broken running gear and started south with Lark through the white quiet. It took him 4 more days to reach his brother's river place. Along the way, the blizzard showed him what it had done. A freight sled lay overturned in a drift with one runner pointing at the sky. 2 mules stood frozen in harness near a fence line, heads bowed as if still leaning into a pole. On the second afternoon, Elias found a campfire pit under a cottonwood bank, the ashes buried but not scattered. Whoever had made it had left before the storm finished, or had been taken by it. At the river place, Elias's brother came out of the barn and stopped in the yard. He did not call Elias's name. He only stared. The valley had already heard that teams were missing on Crowknife Divide. Men had begun counting the dead before the living had finished arriving. Inside the house, near a stove that ticked and breathed red through its iron seams, Elias told the story from the beginning. Lark stopping. The dead wind. The limestone hollow. The wagon bed. The cracks. The hoarse heat. The snow that buried the fourth wall and made it stronger. His brother listened without interrupting. When Elias finished, the room stayed quiet except for the stove and the faint sound of ice sliding from Lark's harness by the door. Finally, his brother asked, "How did you know it would stand?" Elias looked at his hands. The fingertips were bandaged. The nails were blackened. Dried mud still clung in the lines of his skin, no matter how much warm water he had used. He thought about Jonas Keene's lantern under the bridge. The thread of smoke slipping through the crack. Ruth's voice telling the mare, "Easy, girl." The wagon he had hated for being broken. Then he answered, "I didn't need it to stand like a house." He paused. "I needed the wind to find no door." Years later, men still told the story along winter roads north of the river. Not in newspapers, not in ledgers. Stories like that rarely belonged to ink. They belonged to barns, bunkhouses, stove corners, and the mouths of men who had once watched snow come sideways and wondered whether they would see morning. Each telling changed something. Some said Elias had used a mine tarp thick as roofing tin. Some swore the hollow was an old wolf den. Some said he stayed buried 3 days, which was not true. Others gave Lark a different color. Or moved the past 20 miles east. But the center of the story did not change. A grieving freighter with a ruined wagon survived a blizzard that killed better-equipped men because he stopped trying to outrun winter and started thinking like air. He found 3 sides. He built the 4th. He sealed what was small before it became fatal, and when the mountain asked the only question winter ever really asks, "Can the wind get in?" The answer, for one night, was no. That is why the broken wagon mattered. Not because it was strong, because Elias knew where to put it. Not because it could defeat the storm, because it could make the storm go around. And sometimes, in a life already cracked by loss, survival is not the act of becoming unbreakable. Sometimes it is the harder, smaller work of taking what remains, dragging it into the right shape, and closing the seams, one by one until the thing hunting you has no way through.